All right, welcome back to pycse. Today we're going to take a step towards conditional statements that control the operation of a program by talking about some logical operators. And the logical operators are used to combine Boolean values, true and false, to compute things like if two or more things are all true, or if one or more things is true, or if something is not true or not false. And so we can combine them with the operators we talked about last time to say things like if A is greater than B and C is greater than D, we'll do something. But before we get there, we'll look at just exactly how we can combine those. So there are three logical operators that we'll talk about today: and, or, and not. I'm not going to talk about the bitwise logical operators because in the science and engineering calculations I do most of the time, we hardly ever need to use them. All right, so we have three operators to talk about today: and, or, and not. So let's start with and. The and operator takes two arguments and returns true if both of them are true, and returns false if they're not all true. So this is typically represented in this kind of a truth table. So if these are the arguments on the columns and the top here, if you have two arguments that are true and true, then you get a true, and everything else evaluates to false. So let's look at it in practice here. All right, so we would write, we're going to just do it with the regular Boolean variables. True and true returns true, and true and false is going to return false. And this is only returning the last line here, so I'm just going to do it like this. False and true is going to make false, and false is going to be false. Okay, and we'll wrap this in a list now and see all four values. And now we see true, false, false, false as advertised up here. That's when we do things with just two arguments. It's worth noting here that you can do true and true and true and true and so forth. And now this will evaluate to true because they're all true. But if any one of these was false, then we're going to get a false. In other words, they are not all true. So this allows us to combine these different Boolean arguments and figure out whether they're all true or not. Okay? All right. I think that's the main points of and. Is the way to think about and is the two things on either side. If they're both true, it evaluates to true, and if they're not, it evaluates to false. And you can think of this as this is true, and so this one, if we were to parenthesize this, you might evaluate this in parentheses and say it's true, and then evaluate this pair of parentheses, that evaluates to true, and then finally we have true and true is true. Okay, let's talk about the or table. So the or table tells us if one of the elements is true. So if we look here, if we have true and true, it's going to evaluate to true. If we have true and false, it evaluates to true because one of them is. It's like true or false. And then false and true is going to evaluate to true. And then this one, false and false, neither is true, so we get false. All right, let's look at that one. So true or true. That, of course, is true. True or false is going to be true. And false or true, that evaluates to true, and then false or false is going to be false. And I'll wrap this in a list also. And we'll get true, 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 false, which corresponds to this table up here. And much like we saw with and, we can chain these together, so I could say true or false, or false, or false, and this is going to be true because one of them is, and it doesn't matter which one it is. If I say false here and put true in the middle, then this is going to evaluate to true. All right, that's, I think, the main points on OR. The way to think of OR is one of the arguments is true, and it doesn't matter which one. All right, now the last operator is the not operator, and that's kind of like the opposite. So if I say not true, it's going to evaluate to false. And if I say not false, it will evaluate to true. So it just gives you the opposite. So you could use this as a condition if something is not true or if something is not false. All right, and there isn't really an analog of multiple statements. This is just negating one statement. And we can combine them, of course. So we could say not true or false. So what should this one do? True or false will evaluate to true, and then not that will evaluate to false. And I put parentheses around this just to be explicit, so you don't have to really think about what's the order of operation. Is it not true and then or false? That's ambiguous, and I don't usually remember the operator precedence, so whenever I combine these, I almost always use parentheses. And you could do lots of other things. So let's see, we know this one evaluates to false. If I said this one or true, now this is going to this section here will evaluate to false, and it's or true, so this will flip it now to be true. And again, I put parentheses here so there's no ambiguity about the order of operations. All right, so far I've only showed you how the operators work with the real Boolean variables, true or false. And that we need to talk a little bit about what does true and false actually mean. And so it turns out in Python there are several things that are considered false-ish. That is, they act like false statements other than false. So the first one, of course, is false. That one is definitely false-ish. But it turns out that 0 and empty list and empty tuple, all these empty strings, and I believe none also acts as something that is false-ish. So let's see what are the consequences of that. First, let's say not false. That gives us true. What about not 0? That also gives us true. That's pretty remarkable. If I change it to 1, though, we're going to get false, right? So everything that's not in this short list up here is considered truthy. So 0 is false-ish. How about not this? That's going to be true. Not empty tuple. That looks good. Not empty string. Let's just do them all. These are triple quoted strings. And this one I'm a little not sure about, so we'll just see what happens. Not none. Gives us true. All right, so none obviously acts falsy. And let's put a list around here, so we'll just see this will return a lot of trues. All right, so all of these, this is evidence that these act as false-ish false-ish quantities. And everything else is going to be true. So if I put any number, any list, any tuple, any string, and anything not none, then we will get things that are false. So let's try it out. Down here, we'll just do a couple of examples. So let's try -1, and then we'll put a number in here. A letter, and I guess that we don't really have an analog for that. All right, so these, and I need to change this to true. These are all examples of truthy things. And so when we do not of these, we get falses. So that could be something to keep in mind as we think about conditions and using not on what these are. If these were stored in variables, then these will evaluate to false, whereas all of these will evaluate to true. It's a little more subtle than that with and or. With and or, let's move this back up here. With and or, it will not always return true or false. So what we have to remember is that the way these work is defined in the Python documentation, which I just copied and pasted here. The operator not yields true if its argument is false, and false otherwise. So if the argument is considered falsy, then not that argument gives us true, and that's what I showed you up here. And everything else evaluates to false. All right, let's look at and first. So when we say x and y, what happens is the expression x is evaluated first, and if it is false, its value is returned. Otherwise, y is evaluated and y is returned. So let's see what that ends up looking like. So let's pick 0 and false. This is going to return 0 because 0 evaluates to being falsy, and it is the first thing that gets returned. So it's not true. It gets evaluated to 0, which is equivalent to being false. Let's see. How about another one? True and a. This returns or evaluates to the string a, because this is true and this is truthy, so it returns a. And that's potentially useful, but certainly something you want to remember if you are expecting something to be true or false. That and will not always return true or false. And then similarly for or, first x is evaluated, and if it's true, its value is returned. Otherwise, y is evaluated and the resulting value is returned. So let's take a look here at what that kind of means. So if I have 5 or false, then this returns 5. And let's see what happens if I say false or 5. This also returns 5. Right? So it returns the first of the arguments that is basically truthy. Whereas and if I add something up here, this is going to now return 55 because it's the last truthy thing and they were all true. So trying to figure out exactly what gets returned in these complicated combined statements can be a little bit tricky. But what you also could just see is, like, if you were using this as a condition, it doesn't matter if it's false or 55 or true, as long as it acts in a truthy manner. So those are the main points about using these logical operators. And we could now say put it all together, and maybe let's try this. Let's say I have a bank account balance equals 100, and we want to withdraw $50 from it. So let's do balance minus equals 50, and then we'll write here balance greater than 0. So this is the comparison operator that we looked at before, and that returns true. And so if we wanted to, let's see, what would we do for a logical one? We could say balance is greater than 0, and I don't know, what's a good statement here? How about balance is greater than 20, right? So this would tell us, this isn't a very good example, I know. If it's greater than 20, it's also greater than 0. But this would be one kind of example of how we could combine these. All right, so that's it. I should have thought of a better example for this, but this is sort of heading towards being able to do the control statements. I think we'll do one more set of operators before we do that, called the membership operators, and then we will have a good set of operators to work with in the if, elif, else statements. All right, so that's it for today. Mostly this is to look at what do the and, or, and not logical operators do. And next time we'll look at membership operators, and then we'll talk about if, elif, else. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time.